Thank you all for being with us to send off my firstborn to do his military service.
Jeff. We'll be okay, son. Show them what you're made of.
Jy is nie meer iemand nie. Julle is rowe. En is ons werk om julle rowemans te probeer maak. Swart barbare is op ons voorstoep. Luigat geit. Mofgat geit. Kaffer simpatie. Sal nie geduld word nie.
This film is really remarkable and very much a perfect marriage of all the storytelling components that I crave as a viewer, which is style, form, and content coming together. In your career as a filmmaker, is there an art to that marriage that you've discovered with those three storytelling components coming together?
It's definitely about a balance. I would say there's always, I think maybe there's the fear of the style being overt. I think if style kind of takes the precedence or it occupies the foreground too much, you kind of criminal kind of act for a director to have that happen, because it kind of means you haven't done your job. There needs to be this balance of the style kind of being in service pretty much of the storyline. And I think it's probably a lesson directors we've all learned, hopefully while making short films, not making feature films. But yeah, it's an alchemy of balance, which is an ever difficult creative crisis.
Speaking of that balance, was it tricky for you as a storyteller to navigate all these different emotions that are going on in the film? As I was telling Kai earlier when I spoke to him, you'll go from a moment that is very emotional, and I'm going to speak about it lightly, but it involves Nick hearing some information about somebody that he's very close to, and he's walking away, and then you hear sounds later. So I'm curious about that navigation of that emotional tone while also using like sonic storytelling to kind of fill in the gaps.
Yeah, it was sort of a unfolding kind of convention. The sound layering, the nature of the sound in the film was probably the sort of last of my exploratory creative processes. And it definitely also took its rooting mostly when we were in post, particularly with the music. And it was about, I guess, for a character who doesn't get to say a hell of a lot, it was about how do I create a sensitivity to his internal kind of dialogue without it being too overt. And in some level, I started to think about music in his head versus sort of sounds in his head and sort of play with those in a way, and then it was sort of unlocked a kind of, I think, a layer of that characterization that kind of came out in the edit was that kind of uncovering that language with the lead character and his journey.
That was something that Kai had brought up about the music that he would listen to kind of get into that headspace while on set. And then I obviously, I mean, he told me some of the artists like Fleetwood Mac and Bob Dylan and Bjork and some other artists. And then thinking about that, man, I would love to go back and watch it and try to imagine like what that emotional story may be for him, like what sort of information he's getting from that music. Then you have the music that you play over it, which may be classical or opera sounds and things like that. Can you speak to thinking about that music that you may have presented to him or that you guys discussed versus the music that you actually use in the film?
Yeah, I kind of gave Kai, I wanted him to fill it in for himself. I gave him some recommendations on music, but I also wanted him to sort of personalize it for Nicholas and personalize it for Kai, because some of the music he would listen to was not really about the period or about the character. It was just triggering or sort of like sensory for Kai. And it was kind of his process And in terms of how that eventually married with what I put in the film, I would say that my impulses with the actual chosen music in the film came very much out of responding to the footage of the film and the cuts of the film.
Yeah.
And it became quite obvious to me that these ideas were always in my head, but whether it was going to be the Schubert or that particular Schubert or that particular Vivaldi opera, or the folk music, the funk music, not the folk music, the funk music. It was sort of I arrived at these ideas, very much in the post schedule of the film.
Yeah, I really love the way that you used Summer Breeze.
Yes.
That's a song that I love, probably from my love of Richard Linklater and the Days of Confused soundtrack. Is it important to you as a filmmaker to understand every facet of your film? Do you ever dangle anything out there that you don't understand but find interesting because it may lean into the themes in very peculiar ways?
In the finished film, you mean, or in the sort of
yeah, in the finished film, or like when you're on set and you're creating, working with the production designers, and you're putting stuff in the background, and you may not fully understand like what sort of meaning it has, but it's curious to you.
I think it's probably operating on a level. I try to get to a point where I'm operating on a level where it's an impulse, and it's you're always hoping when you shoot a film that you get to a point in the shooting, but like acting, but also this is for directing, where you are living inside of it, and you're living inside of these characters, and so you're kind of open to ideas that might come. And I think like an example of that could be, I have a scene in the film, for example, where the camera just sort of slowly zooms onto one of the characters' sax, and they're in this very tense moment with these kids in these reeds. And I just decided in the moment, I sort of went to the DOP and told him to put the zoom lens on the camera, a 400mm lens, and said to him, like, just zoom in on Matthew for the duration of the scene. And he was kind of going, why would we do that? And I sort of didn't know either, but I was kind of curious to it. And sort of just played the scene out where all of the things that we were going to shoot, like these guys and those guys, we didn't. We just kind of did this other thing. And I wouldn't say at the time I was certain that impulse would make it into the film, but in a way, I sort of knew that was what I wanted that scene to be about, but I didn't know that before I shot it.
Yeah. I actually was going to bring up that very moment. Well, there's quite a few moments, but that one in particular, without saying like what happens in it, it just caused me to think, what the hell is going to happen? But it feeds into this not knowing what's going to happen all throughout the film, like even or kind of hinting at this uncomfortable feeling that permeates throughout the entire film, down to very minor moments, like the way that you use the camera when it's on top of the train, and it's a beautiful background, beautiful scenery, but the train's going forward, and I believe the camera's pulling back.
Yes.
So there's quite a few moments where I'm wrestling with like what the meaning of that may be. But it's interesting.
Sometimes it's really just rhythmic. You're trying to create. I always wanted to make this train look like a snake.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to have like a serpent quality to it. So it was about getting the camera as low to the train as possible and kind of making you feel almost like you were rubbing on top of it, which is technically quite stressful for the operators of the camera, because I really wanted that camera to be as low as it could be with a moving train. But as you know, I always hope to get to a point in the shooting of a film where I'm acting kind of within a headspace. I would say, sort of, for example, that zoom shot, I realized with Moffie as we were making it, that by creating tension through having things play out sometimes outside of the frame of the camera, made things a lot more intense.
Yeah. That was something else that me and Kai were talking about with maybe very quiet moments, but your framing, it may be a close-up of a certain part of the face that kind of lean into the disorientation that we may feel as an audience, because they have, as characters, they have a lot of complex feelings and emotions that they have. So that really stuck out to me.
I have there's a famous photographer, James Nachtwey, who photographs war like that. He does war photography. He's very well known, and he frames people's faces like this. And you're usually seeing the devastation behind them. He intentionally frames them that way to create a commentary on their psychological, what the psychology must be like of living in war. And so I definitely have stolen a few tricks from him.
Would you say that you look for the poetry in everyday things, no matter how horrifying, beautiful, or crushing it is? Because that's what I recognize, because there's so many moments that are quite horrifying, but yet the way that you shoot it makes it kind of beautiful, and it's kind of crazy to admit that as an audience member.
I think maybe what I was always trying to do is push the kind of brutality of it, and then always either spin it into something slightly poetic or slightly soft. Like we've got a sequence where it's something very innocent is happening, and then all of a sudden something really horrific happens. And like I always wanted there to be that pivot, and that particular scene was kind of like the most literal interpretation of that idea. When writing this scene, I was going, well, what could we do at the end of this scene that would just make all of this kind of be forgotten in an instant? And so I just added that other element, and it was, I think that was that is kind of the subtext of the film tonally, is giving you a couple of seconds of humanity and softness, and then kind of immediately taking you back into this other sort of adrenaline, testosterone driven headspace.
I wanted to bring up one specific moment that stuck out to me as well, and it's when that also kind of serves this quiet internal journey of the film, and it's when Nick sits down in the train that is going to the boot camp, and he notices a sign in the background that says, "Don't talk, they may be listening," which is something that carries across the entire film, especially later when a soldier says it's best to stay invisible. So that's another kind of poetic full circle element that you're experimenting with, and I want to know your thoughts on that in creating that.
Often there are things that go beyond me, that other people kind of notice in the layering of the film. I think that we kind of sometimes just operate subliminally with these kinds of themes. It's also the production designer, particularly on this particular film, the production designer, having gone to the military himself and lived through this experience himself to a degree, he also added a layer of that kind of poetry. I would say he added a layer of kind of messaging. One of the sort of more overt ideas that I had is the name of the lead character. His name is Nicholas van der Swart, and Nicholas van der Swart, like van der Swart in English means of black. And so it's a very common last name, but I just thought it would be an interesting, twist on his, because everyone just refers to everyone by their last names, and so he's just off black all the time. He's just there's this idea of being gay in a way was illegal. It was criminal. He was an enemy of the state, very much like a black man. And so those are kind of things that are more for me than really for anyone else. But they also help the actors, I suppose, in finding a sort of center in their characters.
Met a false friend on a lonely, dusty road.
Do whatever you can to stay invisible.
I'm not like you.
Sugar man, takes my question.